You thought things were finally becoming real. And then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost invisibly. The text became slower. The warmth felt less effortless. The closeness that once felt natural suddenly felt harder to reach. And because you are human, because closeness teaches us to expect more closeness, you began asking yourself the question that has broken more hearts than most people realize. Did they stop loving me? Or maybe an even more painful version of it. Did they ever love me at all? Because in the beginning, it felt undeniable. They were present, curious, focused, almost intoxicating. They wanted to know everything about you. You felt chosen, seen, desired, and maybe, for the first time in a very long time, safe. Then slowly, something shifted. And if you have ever loved someone avoidant, you probably know exactly the moment this started. You felt them becoming quieter, harder to reach, more distracted, less emotionally available, sometimes still physically there, but somehow gone at the same time. And this is where most people make the mistake that changes everything. They assume distance means disinterest. Withdrawal means lack of love. Silence means emotional absence. But what if, for someone emotionally defended, love does not first arrive looking closer? What if the moment an avoidant begins to genuinely attach is also the moment fear quietly enters the room? Because here is the truth most people are never taught. Avoidant attachment is not simply fear of closeness. That explanation is too shallow, too simplistic, too easy. What avoidant people often fear is what closeness awakens inside them: dependency, need, exposure, the unbearable possibility that another human being could suddenly matter enough to hurt them. And if you do not understand this, you will almost certainly misread one of the most confusing stages of an avoidant relationship. Because, strangely enough, sometimes the moment they begin feeling more is the exact moment they start pulling back, not because they stopped caring, but because caring became real, and real feels dangerous. Now, that does not mean every avoidant person who withdraws secretly loves you. We need to be careful here. Distance is not automatically devotion. Coldness is not hidden tenderness. Emotional unavailability should never be romanticized into depth. Some people genuinely are disengaging. Some relationships genuinely are ending. And if we fail to acknowledge that truth, we turn psychology into fantasy. This video is not about convincing yourself that breadcrumbs are love. It is about learning how to tell the difference between fear and disinterest, between nervous system overwhelm and emotional absence, because those are not the same thing. And confusing them can cost you years of your life, or the healthiest connection you almost walked away from. So first, we need to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. Because if you only judge an avoidant relationship by behavior, without understanding the nervous system underneath it, nothing about it will make sense. At first, most avoidant relationships feel strangely intense, almost disproportionately intimate. You may even wonder later, how did someone so emotionally distant become so emotionally available in the beginning? And this part matters, because contrary to what many people believe, most avoidant people are not emotionally unavailable at first. In fact, many are deeply attentive, affectionate, curious, present, sometimes overwhelmingly so. They text constantly, call often, want to spend long stretches of time together, seem emotionally invested, and for someone who later feels impossible to reach, that contrast can feel almost cruel, like emotional whiplash. You start asking yourself, which version was real, the beginning or now? But the answer is usually more complicated than either. Because in the beginning, something powerful is happening neurologically. Novelty, dopamine, excitement, the chemistry of discovery. Everything feels new. You are new. The experiences are new. The emotional stimulation is new. And novelty creates momentum, especially for nervous systems that struggle with emotional depth. Dopamine feels manageable, predictable, exciting. There is movement, intensity, adventure, and most importantly, distance still exists psychologically. Nothing feels fully vulnerable yet. Nothing feels permanent. Nothing feels dangerous. At that stage, connection can feel exhilarating because closeness still feels optional, temporary, light enough to escape if needed. And this is where so many people unknowingly become attached to a version of the relationship that was never designed to last. Not because it was fake, but because it was incomplete. The beginning of many relationships is chemistry, not intimacy, momentum, not depth, potential, not stability. And when that beginning starts to shift, many people assume something has gone wrong. But often, something deeper is trying to begin. The problem is, deeper does not always feel better at first, especially to someone emotionally avoidant, because eventually, novelty fades. Not completely, but enough. And once that happens, something terrifying starts to emerge. Real attachment. This is the part no one prepares people for. Because movies trained us to believe love should feel like permanent intensity, permanent certainty, permanent emotional availability. But nervous systems do not work that way, especially defended ones. What happens for many avoidant people is something deeply confusing. As the relationship becomes emotionally meaningful, their nervous system begins sounding alarms. Not because the relationship is bad, but because intimacy is becoming real enough to matter. And matching feels risky. You have to understand. Many avoidant people learned very early in life that emotional dependence comes with pain. Maybe caregivers were inconsistent, critical, emotionally unavailable, intrusive, or perhaps affection came with conditions. Maybe vulnerability was ignored, dismissed, mocked, punished, or simply never met. And over time, the nervous system adapts. Quietly, brilliantly, painfully. It learns a rule: need less, depend less, feel less. Because the less you need, the less you can lose. So eventually, self-sufficiency becomes survival. Distance becomes protection. Emotional independence becomes identity. Not because they do not want love, but because love stopped feeling safe a long time ago. And here is where everything becomes paradoxical. The closer someone gets, the more the nervous system starts whispering. Careful, too close. This could hurt. This could trap you. This could destroy you. Imagine spending your whole life surviving emotional drought, learning to survive on very little, telling yourself you do not need closeness anyway. Then suddenly, someone enters your life who feels warm, consistent, comforting, safe enough to soften around. At first, it feels wonderful, relieving, almost addictive. But eventually, another feeling quietly arrives beside it: fear. Because now, there is something to lose. Now somebody matters. And once somebody matters, their absence matters too. Their rejection matters. Their disappointment matters. Their opinion matters. Their leaving suddenly becomes imaginable. And for a nervous system built around avoiding emotional pain, that is terrifying. This is why many avoidant people experience a strange internal contradiction. Part of them moves closer. Part of them wants to run. Part of them feels warmth. Part of them feels trapped. Part of them longs for connection. Part of them fears what connection will cost. And to the partner watching this happen, It feels unbelievably confusing because you feel the shift. You feel them becoming uncertain, quieter, harder to read. You feel yourself reaching more, trying harder, seeking reassurance, looking for proof that what you experienced was real. And if you lean anxious, this stage can feel almost unbearable because what your nervous system hears is something is wrong. Connection is disappearing. Do something before it's gone. So naturally, you move closer. You text more, ask more questions, try harder, search for clarity. You want reassurance. You want certainty. You want the version of them that felt easier to love. And here is the heartbreaking irony. The more frightened you become, the more frightened they become too. Because what feels like closeness to you can feel like pressure to them. Not because your needs are wrong, not because you are too much, but because emotionally avoidant systems often misread intensity as danger. Even love can feel overwhelming if someone never learned how to receive it safely. And suddenly, both people are hurting, but in opposite directions. One reaches, one retreats, one panics in closeness, one panics in distance. One says, "Please come closer." The other silently says, "Please stop needing so much from me." Though often, neither person fully understands what they are actually saying. And this is where relationships begin breaking in ways neither person intended, not from lack of care, but from misunderstood fear. Yet before we go further, there is something important to understand. Because this is the moment where people either become trapped in confusion or begin seeing clearly. Not every pullback means love, but not every pullback means indifference either. Sometimes, what looks like emotional distance is actually emotional overwhelm. Sometimes silence is avoidance. Sometimes silence is internal conflict. Sometimes withdrawal is disengagement. And sometimes it is somebody standing at the edge of real intimacy for the first time in years, quietly terrified by how much they suddenly have to lose. The challenge is learning the difference. Because real love, especially for someone emotionally defended, rarely enters dramatically. It arrives awkwardly, unevenly, quietly, often hidden beneath behaviors most people misread. And what makes this stage so painful is that love, for an avoidant person, often stops looking romantic right before it becomes real. The intensity fades, the certainty fades, the effortless pursuit softens. And if you only know how to recognize love when it feels loud, you will miss the quieter signs completely. Which is exactly why so many people walk away right at the moment something deeper was trying to form, and why so many others stay far too long, mistaking emotional absence for hidden love. The difference matters more than most people realize. Because understanding someone's nervous system should never mean abandoning yourself. Compassion matters deeply, but compassion without discernment becomes self-abandonment. And somewhere between those two truths is where clarity begins. Because once you stop chasing certainty, you start noticing something else: the quieter language of emotional softening. The almost invisible ways defended people begin moving toward closeness, long before they know how to speak it. And strangely, that movement often begins in places most people never think to look. Because if you have ever loved someone emotionally avoidant, you already know this feeling. Trying to understand them can feel like staring into fog. You start studying patterns, replaying conversations, reading between silences, searching for meaning inside contradictions. One moment, they seem warm, present, even tender. Then suddenly, something changes, and you find yourself wondering if you imagined the closeness entirely. But what if the mistake is not that you are missing something obvious? What if the mistake is that you are looking for love in the wrong language? Because one of the hardest truths about avoidant attachment is this. When avoidant people begin to care deeply, love often stops looking cinematic. It stops looking obvious. It stops arriving wrapped in certainty and begins showing up in quieter ways. Sometimes so quiet, you almost miss them. Not because they are insignificant, but because they rarely resemble the kind of love most people were taught to recognize. And perhaps nowhere is this more misunderstood than what happens when an avoidant person begins feeling safer with you. Notice the word safer. Not healed, not transformed, not suddenly emotionally fluent. Safer, because emotional safety is not a switch. It is a nervous system process. Slow, uneven, fragile, and often invisible while it is happening. You may think love should look bigger, more dramatic, more expressive, but for someone emotionally defended, sometimes love first appears as something surprisingly small. They linger. That is the first thing people often miss. They linger. And if you have never paid attention to this before, you may suddenly realize how meaningful it actually is. They leave slower, stay longer, find reasons not to go just yet. The goodbye becomes strangely stretched. They stand in the doorway a little too long, sit in the car before leaving, text one extra thing after the conversation should have ended. Not dramatic, not grand, just lingering. And lingering matters because avoidance survives on emotional distance. Distance regulates fear. Distance restores control. Distance keeps vulnerability manageable. So when someone avoidant begins staying just a little longer, it often means something important is shifting internally. They are not simply tolerating closeness anymore. Part of them is beginning to seek it, even if they do not yet understand why, even if they would never admit it aloud. And here is the strange thing. Many avoidant people are not consciously aware this is happening. They are not sitting there thinking, I am bonding. I am becoming emotionally attached. No, often, they just feel confused, pulled towards something they cannot explain. And confused attachment feels vulnerable, which means they may soften toward you, while simultaneously acting more uncertain. This is one of the reasons so many people misread avoidance completely. They expect emotional certainty to increase alongside emotional closeness. But often, for avoidant people, greater closeness creates greater internal conflict because now the stakes feel higher. The walls become harder to manage. The need becomes harder to deny. And suddenly, they care enough to be affected by you, which changes everything. This is also why affection begins shifting in ways most people overlook, especially physical affection. At the beginning of relationships, physical closeness often rides on chemistry, novelty, excitement, momentum. It feels electric. But later, something quieter sometimes begins to emerge. Touch without urgency, touch without performance, touch without agenda. And if you have never experienced this shift before, you may accidentally dismiss it because it does not feel dramatic enough. They reach for your hand absent-mindedly, sit closer than they used to, touch your shoulder while passing, rest beside you quietly, stay physically near for no reason at all. No performance, no seduction, no destination, just presence. And for someone avoidant, this can mean far more than people realize. Because physical closeness without purpose requires vulnerability. It means comfort, trust, nervous system settling. It means somebody who once regulated themselves through emotional distance is beginning to find regulation in proximity. That matters deeply, not because it guarantees commitment, but because defended nervous systems rarely soften accidentally. Still, this is where many people unknowingly sabotage what is growing. And this part requires honesty. especially if you tend to love anxiously. Because after long periods of inconsistency, small closeness feels enormous, like finally getting water after drought. And naturally, when someone who felt distant suddenly softens, you want more. You ask questions, seek reassurance, try to define what is happening. You want clarity, safety, certainty. You want to know, does this mean something? But certainty pursued too quickly can sometimes frighten nervous systems already struggling with vulnerability. Again, this does not mean your needs are wrong. It does not mean becoming smaller or pretending not to care. It simply means understanding timing. Because closeness forced too quickly can feel overwhelming to someone still learning emotional trust. Imagine someone standing ankle deep in water for the first time, terrified, but trying, curious, but cautious. And the moment they take one step deeper, someone pulls them toward the middle of the ocean. What happens? Fear takes over. Retreat becomes survival. Not because water is bad, but because overwhelm arrived too quickly. Sometimes emotional closeness works similarly. The safer response is often quieter, receiving softness without immediately demanding proof, allowing moments to breathe, noticing what is increasing over time. And here is where perspective becomes everything. Because avoidant growth rarely looks linear. It looks awkward, messy, contradictory. One day they soften. The next day they seem distant. One moment they linger. The next moment they withdraw. And if you judge everything by individual moments, you will drive yourself insane. You will interpret every retreat as rejection, every silence as proof, every inconsistency as final. But nervous systems are patterns, not snapshots, which means the better question is not, what happened today? The better question becomes, what direction are things moving over time? Are they lingering more than before? Opening slightly more than before? Seeking proximity more than before? Recovering from distance faster than before? Because healing, or even softening, rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes it arrives in millimeters, tiny shifts, almost invisible changes. And if you are only looking for fireworks, you will miss the slow rebuilding entirely. Still, there is another sign of emotional softening that people almost always misunderstand. And strangely, it often appears exactly when life becomes difficult, not when things feel easy, not during romance, not during perfect weekends, but when stress enters the picture. Because one of the clearest indicators of emotional trust is where someone turns when life starts hurting. And for someone avoidant, that shift can quietly change everything. Because stress reveals attachment faster than romance ever will. Anyone can feel close when life feels easy, when chemistry is high, when weekends are soft, when nothing threatens the nervous system. But emotional trust, real emotional trust, often reveals itself when something difficult enters the room. And for someone avoidant, difficulty usually activates an old instinct. Handle it alone. Disappear. Solve. Contain. Protect. Not because they enjoy isolation, but because independence became survival long ago. Many emotionally avoidant people learned something painful very early. Needing people felt dangerous. Vulnerability felt costly. Depending on others often ended in disappointment, criticism, overwhelm, or abandonment. So they adapted by becoming emotionally self-sufficient, or at least appearing to be. And over time, that adaptation becomes identity. The strong one, the capable one, the independent one, the one who does not need anyone, at least on the surface. But underneath that independence, something far quieter often exists. A nervous system exhausted from carrying everything alone. A person who secretly wants closeness without knowing how to safely trust it, which is why one of the deepest shifts you can notice in an avoidant person is this. They slowly begin letting you witness their struggles. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but subtly, quietly, almost accidentally. They mention stress, tell you something difficult happened, reveal uncertainty before everything is solved. And this may sound small, but psychologically, it matters more than many people realize. Because emotionally avoidant people often hide pain until it becomes manageable. You hear about problems after they are fixed, after they have regained control, after vulnerability has already been hidden. So when someone avoidant begins saying, "Work has been rough lately. I've been overwhelmed. I don't really know what to do about this," something important may be happening internally. Not because vulnerability suddenly feels comfortable, but because trust is quietly entering spaces fear used to control. And again, this is where people often misread the moment, because the sharing may still feel limited, brief, emotionally restrained. You might think, that's all. Why aren't they opening more? But you are measuring them through your emotional language, not theirs. And avoidant attachment often speaks softly at first. The invitation may not sound like, "I need you." It may sound like, "Today was hard." And that sentence alone may have cost them far more vulnerability than you realize. Because internally, many avoidant people carry a fear few openly talk about, the fear of being emotionally incompetent, of needing something they do not understand, of exposing weakness and losing respect, especially if competence has always been how they survived. Think about it. What happens when someone spends years believing strength means self-sufficiency? When emotions feel messy, needs feel dangerous, dependence feels humiliating, then suddenly, they care about someone deeply enough to feel vulnerable, to feel uncertainty, to feel fear of loss. It becomes destabilizing because now they are feeling emotions they were never taught to process. And that destabilization often appears in a surprisingly misunderstood way. Their words become messier, not clearer. This surprises almost everyone because people assume emotional intimacy creates better communication. But with avoidant attachment, sometimes the opposite happens first. They stumble, pause, struggle for words, suddenly seem less emotionally articulate than before. And if you do not understand what is happening, you may mistake vulnerability for emotional unavailability. You ask, "How do you feel?" And suddenly, someone who sounds brilliant everywhere else goes quiet, awkward, confused. Maybe they say, "I don't know how to explain it. I'm trying to figure it out. I feel something, but I don't know what it is." And this can feel frustrating, especially if you are emotionally expressive, because your instinct may become, "Just say it. Use words. Help me understand." But here is the difficult truth. Sometimes emotional language develops far slower than emotional experience, especially in people who learn to suppress emotion early. Imagine asking someone to describe a country they have barely visited. They may know something important is there, but lack language for the terrain. And for avoidant people, this emotional unfamiliarity can feel deeply embarrassing because competence often matters to them. Being capable matters, knowing matters, and now suddenly, they feel emotionally clumsy, like someone learning to walk publicly, which means impatience often becomes dangerous here. Finishing their sentences, interpreting for them, pressuring faster vulnerability, demanding immediate clarity. All of it can unintentionally reinforce an old fear. I am failing emotionally. This is unsafe. Retreat. Again, this does not mean abandoning yourself or accepting endless confusion. But there is a difference between inviting vulnerability and interrogating it, a difference between making space and demanding emotional performance. Sometimes the kindest thing you can offer in these moments is patience, stillness, the emotional permission to stumble. Because for someone avoidant, learning emotional intimacy often feels less like opening a door and more like learning a language they were never taught. Slowly, imperfectly, with long pauses between words. And perhaps what matters most is not fluency yet, but willingness. Are they trying, returning, reaching, even awkwardly? Because willingness matters, especially when emotional fear runs deep. But there is another quiet shift that often begins happening once emotional safety grows. And strangely, it tends to appear through something much less romantic than most people expect. Questions, not poetic questions, not grand declarations, but practical ones, specific ones, questions that almost feel oddly measurable. At first glance, they may not even seem emotional, but underneath them, something surprisingly meaningful may be unfolding. Because when avoidant people begin imagining permanence, they often stop speaking the language of fantasy and start speaking the language of systems. This is where many relationships become deeply misunderstood, especially by partners longing for reassurance. Because while one person may be craving emotional certainty, the avoidant person may quietly be trying to understand. How do I make this actually work? Not romantically, practically, sustainably, safely. And this is often the phase where something subtle begins shifting. They start asking questions. Quiet, strangely specific questions. Questions that can almost sound unromantic at first. What makes you feel close? How much time together feels good for you? What helps when you're upset? What did you mean when you said disconnected? Now, if you are waiting for movie script romance, you may accidentally overlook what is happening here. Because emotionally avoidant people often seek security through understanding. They move towards certainty through clarity, not emotional guessing, not intuition alone, but structure. And underneath those practical questions, something meaningful may be occurring. They may be trying to build a map for loving you, a map for not failing, a map for staying. Because one of the least understood fears inside avoidant attachment is this. What if closeness eventually becomes impossible to survive? Not because they do not care, but because emotional expectations often feel infinite when left undefined. And infinite feels dangerous, especially to someone already overwhelmed by intimacy. Think about it. If someone says, I just want to feel loved, that sounds emotionally simple. But for someone avoidant, it may sound impossibly vague. What does loved mean? How much? How often? How do I know if I'm succeeding? What if I fail? What if the expectation keeps growing? What if no matter what I do, it is never enough? And when emotional expectations feel impossible to measure, withdrawal often becomes protection, not because love is absent, but because overwhelm has arrived, which is why clarity matters more than many people realize. Healthy clarity, not controlling, not transactional, not performative, but honest, specific, grounded. Because real intimacy does not only happen through emotion. Sometimes it happens through understanding, through translating emotional needs into something sustainable, something visible, something possible. And perhaps this is where many people unknowingly sabotage something that could have grown. They assume, if they loved me, they would just know. But no nervous system reads minds, especially one built around emotional self-protection. And this becomes even more important when you understand what often happens next. Because avoidant attachment rarely moves in straight lines. This may be one of the hardest truths to accept. Healing, real healing, often looks inconsistent. Closer, then distant. Warmer, then suddenly unavailable. Present, then quiet again. And if you do not understand the deeper pattern, you may mistake fluctuation for indifference. But psychologically, something more complicated may be happening. Closeness itself can activate fear, not always consciously, not logically, but neurologically, because intimacy often awakens old memories stored beneath awareness. The body remembers what the mind forgot. And if closeness once carried danger, criticism, engulfment, pressure, loss, then love itself may begin activating an old alarm system, which creates a painful paradox. The closer they feel, the more vulnerable they become. And the more vulnerable they become, the more their system sometimes wants distance. Not because connection feels meaningless, but because it suddenly feels terrifyingly meaningful. This is why some of the most confusing moments happen right after emotional closeness, right after a beautiful weekend, right after vulnerability, right after things finally seem to be improving. Suddenly, distance, withdrawal, silence, and for the partner receiving that shift, it can feel devastating. You think, I knew it. The closeness wasn't real. They lost feelings. But sometimes, what you are witnessing is emotional overwhelm, the nervous system pulling back to regulate itself. Again, this does not excuse emotional inconsistency forever. Patterns matter. Reciprocity matters. Healthy relationships still require accountability. But if we only judge avoidant attachment through isolated moments, we often miss the deeper trend, and trends tell a truer story. So perhaps the question becomes not, did they pull away this week? But, compared to months ago, are they slowly moving closer? Are vulnerable moments increasing? Are conversations deepening? Are they sharing more? Repairing faster? Returning warmer? Trying harder? Because progress in emotionally avoidant dynamics often looks frustratingly nonlinear. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, then 3 forward, then another retreat, like someone walking toward warmth while still flinching from the fire. And yes, that uncertainty can become exhausting, which is why this part matters deeply. You cannot build your emotional stability around someone else's inconsistency. You cannot abandon yourself waiting for potential. You cannot confuse longing for intimacy with proof of intimacy, because no amount of understanding attachment should require self-erasure. The goal is never to romanticize emotional unavailability, never to turn breadcrumbs into evidence of forever. The goal is discernment, to see clearly, without fantasy, without projection, without abandoning reality. And reality asks harder questions. Not, do they sometimes care? But, are they consistently moving toward emotional responsibility? Are they growing? Are they building? Are they learning how to love in ways that become safer over time? Because effort matters, direction matters, willingness matters, especially when healing is involved. But there is one final misunderstanding that quietly destroys many relationships with avoidant people, even when love is genuinely beginning to form. A misunderstanding so common that many walk away right at the edge of something real, not because love disappeared, but because they misread what changing chemistry actually means. Because one of the quietest tragedies inside avoidant attachment is how often people mistake the end of intensity for the end of love. And perhaps nowhere is this misunderstanding more destructive than here, right at the moment when something deeper could have begun. You see, early connection often feels intoxicating, especially with emotionally avoidant people. There is chemistry, attention, Intensity, a kind of emotional electricity. The beginning feels alive, charged, magnetic, and then something changes. The emotional high softens, the urgency fades, the constant pursuit slows, and suddenly fear enters the room. For the partner, they're losing interest. For the avoidant person, maybe this means we lost the spark. And here, many relationships quietly collapse, not because love failed, but because both people misunderstood what was happening. Because intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. Intensity feels immediate. Intimacy grows slowly. Intensity overwhelms the nervous system. Intimacy settles it. And for someone avoidant, this transition often feels deeply confusing. Because if emotional chaos once felt familiar, calm can accidentally feel empty. If unpredictability once felt like chemistry, peace can feel suspiciously unfamiliar. And so they begin asking themselves questions they do not fully understand. Why doesn't this feel like before? Why is the rush fading? Did I choose wrong? But perhaps the better question becomes, what if the disappearance of adrenaline was never the disappearance of love? What if it was simply the nervous system moving out of survival and into something quieter, something slower, something unfamiliar? Because real connection often sounds less dramatic than fantasy promised. It looks smaller, quieter, less cinematic. Someone remembering your stress, checking in, staying through discomfort, trying again after conflict, learning your emotional language, turning toward you when life becomes difficult, trying to understand what safety even means. And perhaps this is where we need to become deeply honest, not romantic, honest, because not every avoidant person is emotionally available. Not every avoidant dynamic becomes healthy. Sometimes someone stays emotionally disconnected for years. Sometimes effort never arrives. Sometimes healing never becomes mutual. And understanding attachment should never become permission to abandon your own needs indefinitely. You cannot build a future entirely on potential. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot carry intimacy alone. But when effort exists, when growth exists, when willingness exists, something meaningful can happen. Slowly, messily, imperfectly. The nervous system learns. Trust expands. Fear softens. And love begins looking different than fantasy taught us. Less dramatic. More real. Not, I can't live without you. But, I'm learning how to stay. Not, I'll never pull away again. But, I'm trying to come back differently. Not, I know exactly how to love. But, teach me how to stop losing what matters. And perhaps that is the deeper question hidden beneath this entire conversation. Not, can an avoidant person love? But, what does love actually look like when fear has been part of someone's survival for a very long time? Maybe love looks quieter than we expected. Maybe it arrives awkwardly, incomplete, clumsy. Maybe it stumbles before it speaks. Maybe it reaches before it fully trusts. Maybe it learns. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is this. Sometimes we miss real progress because we were waiting for perfect certainty, waiting for flawless emotional expression, waiting for movie scene reassurance, when healing rarely unfolds that cleanly. Still, discernment matters because the difference between potential and progress is movement, not promises, not excuses, movement toward accountability, toward vulnerability, toward repair, toward emotional presence, toward you. And if you have been loving someone avoidant, perhaps this is the question worth carrying forward. Are they slowly learning how to meet love? Or are you slowly disappearing, trying to hold it together alone? Because your nervous system matters too. Your emotional safety matters too. Love should stretch you, but it should not erase you. And maybe, just maybe, the deepest form of healing is not learning how to endlessly tolerate emotional distance, but learning how to recognize the difference between fear that is healing and fear that has chosen to stay hidden forever. If this conversation helped you see something differently, or finally put words to something you've been quietly living through, right? I see the pattern now in the comments. I read them. And more importantly, someone else silently struggling through this may read your words and realize they are not imagining what they have been feeling. And if you're trying to understand avoidant attachment without romanticizing it, without demonizing it either, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey. Because here, we do not chase surface advice. We go underneath the behavior, into the nervous system, into the psychology, into the invisible emotional patterns shaping the relationships people rarely know how to explain. Until next time, protect your peace, stay honest with yourself, and remember, the healthiest love is not the one that asks you to disappear. It is the one that slowly teaches both people how to stay.